the context of such a paranoid and, if need be, ruthless regime, actually, we are getting a sense that people are thinking, this is another mistake. And the very fact that Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, a man who is widely despised by his own men, and yet Putin keeps him there, even though there's a lot of people who want him to be replaced. And it sounds like Gerasimov seems to have been the person who, when he was told reports of the Ukrainians preparing for battle, that he ruled it out as being unlikely, or else that it was going to only be a minor incident. Again, what happens is criticism of Gerasimov becomes a coded way of actually criticizing Putin. So I wouldn't want to overplay this. We're not going to see some kind of coup against him next Wednesday. But on the other hand, it is clear that bit by bit, people are getting more and more dissatisfied with what they feel is Putin's inability to really get a handle on not just his current crisis, but the war as a whole. I'm Mark Galeotti. I'm the executive director of the consultancy Mayak Intelligence. And amongst my most recent books are Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine. Tuesday of last week, what we had was the first signs that there was going to be a cross-border incursion that was on a totally different scale from the ones we've seen in the past. And I think this is one of the things that caught the Russians by surprise. They had had some prior intelligence that something was happening, and they thought it was going to be some little pinprick. 100 troops go over there, occupy some little hamlet, take some video, and then leave. But this was actually a major incursion. And what's more, it was being carried out by regular Ukrainian troops, some of their best, equipped with a whole variety of Western armored vehicles and weapon systems. And they very much sort of demonstrated that they were there for a serious purpose, because they swept through the various border guards and some conscript units of soldiers. There were some substantial numbers of prisoners taken in the very first days. And they're very quickly pushed out to an area which actually has now sort of expanded to about 1,000 square kilometers across, roughly speaking, about a 40-kilometer front. And pushing out, so although if you look at some maps, it's a very sort of weird sort of shape. It's very much shaped by the main roads that they were able to zoom along before the Russians were able to get their act together. So on the one hand, this is obviously a serious incursion, and they're already beginning to dig in some of the territories they've taken, particularly the very small town of Sudzha. But on the other hand, it's still not entirely clear whether their intention is precisely to be there for the long haul, or whether at some point they will actually make a controlled and careful withdrawal, having made the point that they can actually launch a surprise offensive across the border like this. One of the problems we have trying to assess precisely what the Ukrainians are up to and what their overall sort of maximal strategic goal is. Remember, they will have all kinds of different goals, from the sort of minimum they hope to achieve all the way to the maximum, is quite why they targeted Kursk instead of another border region such as Belgorod, which is where they've had raids in the past. And the answer seems to be, first of all, just simply because they hadn't raided Kursk before, so the Russian level of readiness there was even less. Secondly, it's because they're hoping to draw troops away, not just from the battle lines on the Donbass in the east of Ukraine, but also from a Russian offensive against the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, which is a bit further away. So again, you want to be able to pull troops further. And finally, there are a variety of potential objectives. There was the small town of Sudzha, which also has a key way station on this pipeline that takes gas from Russia into Europe. About half of all the Russian gas still going to Europe goes through that pipeline. There's the Kursk nuclear power station, which potentially they might have wanted to take as a sort of almost a tit for tat for the Russians having seized their nuclear power station in Zaporizhia. And although there's no real chance that they could take the city of Kursk itself, by simply threatening it, they make a much greater political message. But it has to be stressed, at present, this is just guesswork. The Ukrainians have been very, very cagey about what they're after, both for operational security, but also for political reasons, because they're going to want to basically claim whatever they do eventually accomplish is what they plan to accomplish all along. The Russian response has really been quite piecemeal and quite frankly lacking in any kind of clear direction. We've had evacuations. There's about 120,000 people who have been evacuated away from the border areas in Kursk, but also in other regions. And although the central government says it's looking after these people, in practice it's basically dumped the burden of that onto the emergencies ministry and the local governors, which is already a point of contention. Militarily, what we had was at first they just threw whatever troops they had available at the Ukrainians, which was disastrous because the troops they had available there were on the whole conscripts, many of whom hadn't even finished their basic training, so they scarcely knew which was the dangerous end of a Kalashnikov. Or else they were newly recruited reservists who hadn't yet been implanted into units and had a chance to actually sort of form coherent units. So putting these against hardened Ukrainian veterans, no wonder we had mass surrenders. On the whole, for example, Russian troops on the Donbas region do not surrender. So it's actually been quite striking how badly that worked. Now, they're slowly beginning to get their act together. But the key thing is militarily that Putin does not want to weaken his continued attack on the Donbas region. That's his real priority. And frankly, the Russians are continuing to advance there. And so he's trying to do everything he can to avoid having to transfer those seasoned troops to deal with this. So they're looking elsewhere, whether it's in terms of they have conscripts coming in from Kaliningrad on the Baltic, Murmansk up in the Arctic, to forces that are sort of more locally based. But again, it's more or less just sort of the military equivalent, frankly, of sort of looking behind the sofa cushions to see if there's any loose change. And finally, politically, and again, here Putin, true to form, does not handle crises well. He's tried to play it down. He won't even use the terms like invasion or whatever. He's using these bland euphemisms like the situation. He is trying to present this really as just some kind of almost pinprick. The very fact that he's actually declaring what's called an anti-terrorism operation as the sort of form of martial law that's declared, again, just trying to imply that it's just basically a sort of strange bunch of hoodlums rather than a serious and organized attack. But at the same time, obviously, the Russian state itself is beginning to mobilize. In classic form, it's not thanks to Putin, but despite Putin, that we're beginning to see the Russian military get their act together. And increasingly, although they're not yet at the level of pushing the Ukrainians back, they certainly have managed to slow down the Ukrainian advance. We've seen the political leaderships locally begin to handle the question of refugees and the like. But the point is, this is all very much making do. There doesn't seem to be, at the moment, any kind of big picture, except for Putin's desire that this whole crisis go away. One of the things that's really interesting about this crisis is, look, this is a vicious authoritarian regime. It's got even worse over time. And therefore, you can't really openly criticize policy or the administration, let alone Putin, without running the risk of ending up in prison at best. But on the other hand, what happens is there are these other ways, these coded ways in which disagreement and dissent are communicated. And we are seeing this. For example, even within the essentially rather muzzled state media, there have been news articles where people have gone down and spoken to people who've been forced out of their homes and so forth, and reported their statements clearly expressing the fact that they feel that they've been betrayed and let down, not just by local government, but all the way up to the Kremlin. Likewise, the very fact that we're not seeing a lot of the key figures within the government rushing forward to say, oh, absolutely, the central policy is absolutely fine. This may not sound like much, but in the context of such a paranoid and, if need be, ruthless regime, actually, we are getting a sense that people are thinking, this is another mistake. And the very fact that Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, a man who is widely despised by his own men, and yet Putin keeps him there, even though there's a lot of people who want him to be replaced. And it sounds like Gerasimov seems to have been the person who, when he was told reports of the Ukrainians preparing for battle, that he ruled it out as being unlikely, or else that it was going to only be a minor incident. Again, what happens is criticism of Gerasimov becomes a coded way of actually criticizing Putin. So I wouldn't want to overplay this. We're not going to see some kind of coup against him next Wednesday. But on the other hand, it is clear that bit by bit, people are getting more and more dissatisfied with what they feel is Putin's inability to really get a handle on not just his current crisis, but the war as a whole. Well, obviously, our focus is very much on the Kursk region because there we actually have incursions on the ground. At the same time, the Ukrainians seem to be widening their campaign of attacking Russian airfields. Now, this is absolutely crucial because at the moment, one of the key weapons that the Russians are using are these so-called glide bombs, very large airdrop bombs, which have got an extra kit on them, which allows them to be guided, not always with the most greatest of precision. But the point is, what the Russian planes can do is, while still in Russian airspace, they can drop these bombs, which can then glide quite deep into Ukraine. And these are being used to really pound not just Ukrainian cities and critical national infrastructure, but also military concentrations. And so I think what the Ukrainians are also trying to do is attack these at source, because they can't really shoot down the Russian planes in most cases while they're still in Russian airspace. They're going for the airfields where the planes are based, but also where there's substantial stocks of these glide bombs. And we know that a lot of them have actually been destroyed. So this is all part of a Ukrainian campaign to do, I think, two things. And this is how it links in with the whole Kursk incursion. First of all, it's just simply to push back the Russian forces that are hitting Ukraine. They can't stop it from happening, but they can try and reduce it and try and force them to have to do it further and further away, which means that they can reach less far actually into Ukraine itself, safely at least. The second thing is, though, it's about changing the political narrative. And again, this is, I think, really important for Zelensky. He has to obviously encourage his own people, who, after all, have this year essentially seen the news just simply about slow but nonetheless apparently unstoppable Russian advances. But also the narrative in the West, where precisely there was a degree of Ukraine fatigue beginning to emerge, a sense of, look, well, Ukraine can't win. So the question is, when can Ukraine start to make some kind of a deal which will trade land for peace? So what Zelensky is trying to do is say, no, actually, Ukraine can surprise you. We can still launch these kind of attacks. We can reach out and hit Russian airfields. We can reach out and move into Russian territory and show that although Russia is a much larger country, nonetheless, it does not mean that it's a done deal. What's really interesting about this particular offensive is the degree to which precisely it has depended upon Western provided kit in so many ways. We've seen American Stryker combat vehicles being very much used at the forefront. We've also seen German equipment, Italian equipment, French, and obviously also British. First of all, there are accounts of AS-90 self-propelled guns being used. And then most recently, accounts, which we have to say haven't been confirmed, of Challenger 2 tanks being used, and possibly, though it's quite iffy, the claims, but nonetheless, possibly one of them actually being destroyed. This would be the second combat loss of the 14, if it's true. And I think it's really interesting for several reasons. One is, obviously, it shows just how far Western aid has been absolutely essential in providing the kind of additional sort of tip of the spear to the Ukrainian forces. Secondly, again, part of the political dimension of this campaign, in my opinion, is Kyiv is trying to, in some ways, nudge, maybe even force the West into accepting rather more relaxed rules of engagement. There's some quite definite restrictions on what they can use Western supplied kit. And if we look at the British, for example, Britain has been relatively relaxed. It's only really the long-range Storm Shadow missiles that we provided that they are definitely saying, no, these have to not to be used in mainland Russia, but only in sort of occupied territories of Ukraine, as we've seen in Crimea, for example. Apart from that, Britain is actually being fairly sort of easy about how they use it, because this is all a war of defense. And even if it's technically this Kursk incursion is an invasion, it's an invasion in the context of a much larger and more brutal Russian one. It's part of the sort of the back and forth of the flow of sort of line of fighting. But it has to be said that there are other allies, particularly European allies, that are less comfortable with seeing their own kit being used there. It's either more politically sensitive at home, or they're still trying to sort of keep some kind of constraints on what's there. So I think from the Ukrainians' point of view, they want to use a lot of this Western kit, have it seem to be being used in Russia, simply to almost establish the principle that then they can, in a way, rely on that in the future as a precedent. I mean, at the moment, there is quite a debate as to whether or not the restrictions on Storm Shadows ought to be lifted. And I honestly have no kind of inside knowledge as to whether they will or won't. Generally speaking, there's a pretty inexorable logic that sort of actually means that there's a continued relaxation. And quite frankly, one could argue that where is the logic that says that a British AS-90 self-propelled howitzer can be driven into Russia and then used to shell targets further into Russia, but somehow a missile launched from Ukrainian airspace should not be used to hit that same target? When it comes down to it, a target is a target. And although I appreciate there are some concerns about precisely how the Russians view it, firstly, we have allowed ourselves to tie our own hands too often by worries about what Putin's red lines may be. Putin does have red lines, but they are much, much more basic. They're about his own personal survival and so forth, rather than about a specific piece of kit. And secondly, I think we must acknowledge the degree to which, as far as Putin is concerned, and he says it himself, he is at war with the West. Not a shooting war, thank God, and I don't think it's likely to become one. I mean, despite some fears, I think he has no intentions of attacking NATO directly. But a political, economic, cultural, legal, covert, sabotage, you name it kind of war, we're already in that. And when we have, for example, Russian intelligence agents arranging for warehouses to be burnt in Layton because they're linked to the Ukrainians, then it raises the question of why we should be so cautious about the use of our own missiles against what are going to be specifically military targets. It's quite interesting seeing Putin's public appearances ever since the start of the Kursk incursion. When he had his first meeting with members of his Security Council, he was looking much, I thought, less confident and comfortable than he had been of late. Instead, he was moody, he was grumpy, he snapped at the acting governor of Kursk region when he started to talk about the extent to which the Ukrainians had penetrated the region. Said, no, yes, just deal with the humanitarian issues, the military people will talk about that. He was actually working off written notes, which again, we don't tend to see. Now, on one level, big deal. But it does, I think, suggest the degree to which he was rattled. And in particular, what's really striking is the degree to which he continued to try and distance himself. This is classic Putin. Putin, for all his kind of macho public persona, doesn't make decisions quickly, doesn't really like to be involved in high-stakes situations. And whenever there's anything that doesn't go well, he tries to make sure that it's someone else's problem and that therefore someone else will get the blame. And so what we have seen Putin making public statements, but essentially it's public statements saying, I'm relying on the military and the emergencies ministry and the local governors and so forth to get a handle on this problem. So instead of leadership, what he's demonstrating is, as ever, passing the buck. So I think this obviously speaks to himself and his own weaknesses and the fact that, yes, I mean, he is getting on. He's not the same Putin as he was 20 years ago when he was a relatively sort of vigorous young national leader. But it also expresses the fact that he doesn't seem to feel that this is going to be a quick and easy fix. And it's quite striking, for example, that we have seen, for example, reports of preparations for the movement of conscript units to the area that are actually scheduled to happen in September. So, even the Russian military seems to be planning on the basis that this may be rolling into next month at the very least. So, I mean, I think in this context, Putin is not coming out of this well. But that doesn't mean to say that we should expect some kind of coup against him. It's part of the slow accretional erosion of his position on the pedestal on which he placed himself. But at the same time, it's worth noting that there is a certain primordial sense of patriotism that Russians have. And there is quite a bit of anger within the country. Again, looking at, for example, social media and the like, people who are not necessarily fans of Putin, but who nonetheless are outraged at the idea of Ukrainian troops being on Russian soil, on Russians being turned into displaced persons and the like. Now, one can say, well, what should they expect or whatever? I mean, that's easy for us to say. But nonetheless, I mean, it is clear that there is this interesting tension between anger at Putin at clearly not being able to master a war that he himself started. This is very much Putin's war. But also a sense that maybe now is not the time to do anything about it because the motherland is in danger.